The default mode network is probably one of the most important things in your brain that most people don't understand. It is a group of brain regions that are very active when we are at rest. We used to think when we had no specific task that the brain was inactive, yet that is actually when our brain jumps into a different gear and dives into self-referential thoughts and rumination. In fact, the default mode network is essential for creativity and imagining the future. It's part of how we replay and store our memories, and it's also an essential component in our own theory of mind, which we'll dive into later, especially how we understand the concept of other people's thoughts. To put it simply, without a default mode network in your brain, you would be very lost and quite impaired as a human. Yet, if you have an overactive default mode network, that can also be related to many problems, such as depression, anxiety, and ADHD, which we'll go into in this episode, but also things like schizophrenia and autism, and of course, the most pervasive human problem of all, our ego. Understanding how the default mode network works is an essential step in understanding any intervention you might want to try to build a more positive step away from things you're trying to avoid, like depression, anxiety, or ADHD and distraction. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris. I hope you have your thinking caps on because today is going to be actually really interesting, even though it sounds like I'm talking about regions of the brain, which I am, but very exciting regions of the brain. And I'm sure by the end of this, you're going to be running to people on the street and being like, oh my God, have you heard of your default mode network? I've been trying to contain myself. Anyway. The first person to look into the whole topic of a default mode network was an underappreciated scientific genius, the German Hans Berger. He was born in 1873. One day when he was 19, his sister was overwhelmed by a feeling that young Hans was in grave danger. She made her father contact the training base where the young old Hans was. Incredibly, although not great for Hans, he had just been thrown from his horse in a terrible accident and was genuinely fighting for his life. Now, Hans's dad probably never questioned his telepathic daughter again, and afterwards, Hans himself became quite obsessed with the power of the mind, and he set out to map it. A mere 30 years of obsessive tinkering later, in 1920, Hans invented and built the first electroencephalogram, or EEG for short, by sticking a series of electrodes across someone's head, and with some clever engineering to interpret all of the data, he could measure the electrical activity of the brain. You may recognize the EEG device as the classic tool of evil scientific maniacs from dystopian futures, but it's actually overall a very good thing. In fact, it wasn't all that long ago in human history that the only way to study the brain had been to cut little parts of brain out of living people and see what would happen. I don't know about you, but personally I prefer to have electrodes all over my head, but perhaps I'm picky or something. Like many of the most monumental scientific breakthroughs in history, the scientists of the time were completely unimpressed and thought Hans was just a bit of an idiot. Hans was, let's say, saddened by the reception, but he was convinced that he was onto something. Hans decided to try and map the neurophysiology behind psychic phenomenon, which probably didn't help his credibility, but he did manage to create a lot of data surrounding brain activity relating to different mental states. He also proved that the EEG could be impressively accurate for diagnosing mental and neurological conditions. It was during his research that he realized the brain seemed to have a lot of idling activity, where he posited that it was probably doing something despite the patient seeming to be at rest. Sadly, however, with little recognition from the science community and with his country becoming Nazified and making scientific research increasingly difficult, he retired in 1939 and then committed suicide in 1941 without really seeing any of his work adopted. However, his efforts had shown that the brain had an almost constant rate of activity, even at rest. So, to make an analogy, if you use your muscles for movement, it's using a lot of energy, yet when you're at rest, your bicep, for example, isn't doing very much at all and isn't using much energy. But let's say I gave you an incredibly hard math problem to solve whilst you're also trying to balance on a surfboard. Your brain is going to be at its 100% max output and energy use. Yet, if you were to sit and do nothing, your brain would be operating at about 96% of its output and energy usage, which is astoundingly similar. And despite this discovery, it wasn't until the 21st century that Marcus Raichlen and some other scientists proved the existence of the default mode network that was able to account for a lot of this unexplained activity. They used much more detailed fMRI scans to identify all the specific brain regions that are lighting up when someone is not engaged in a task and when the default mode network has taken over. It did take a hot while to work out all of the different things that are going on in the default mode network, and we're honestly still finding out in some areas. But I will go over the main agreed activities of a default mode network, which will make it obvious to understand how it affects things like depression or ADHD. So, default mode network, as I've mentioned, involves several different brain regions, and they become active when we are more at rest. What it does during this time is primarily related to 6 different internal mental activities rather than interactions with things like the external world. So the first main thing is self-referential thought. This is when individuals are thinking about themselves, such as reflecting on personal qualities or analyzing one's own behavior. It generally supports a wide range of self-related cognition, from assessing one's past actions to planning future ones. And it's really integral to maintaining your own narrative identity. Hence, it is very tied to the ego. Next is theory of mind. And this is where we are able to understand other people's point of view and mental states. Tests show, for example, that a young toddler could watch me hide a ball inside a box, and they would think that someone else that didn't see me do it would know where that ball is. They're unable to grasp that someone else has different knowledge. Yet, as we age, we're able to start perceiving what others may have understood and think from their point of view. And the default mode network plays a key role here in things like social cognition, which is essential for empathizing with others and predicting their behaviors. And this is, of course, key for social interaction and survival in a social world. Thirdly, the default mode network is involved in recalling personal memories, otherwise known as our autobiographical memory. And this is the ability to think about past experiences in a detailed, often vivid way, and includes integrating these memories into someone's own life narrative, which helps to reinforce a sense of continuity and identity over time. Again, very important part of our self-image and our ego. The fourth part of the default mode network is in imagining the future. It becomes very active when people engage in envisioning future scenarios, whether that's planning ahead or daydreaming about possible events. It really helps simulate our potential outcomes and makes decisions based on the simulations that we're playing. Quite linked to this is the next task of the default mode network, which is daydreaming and mind-wandering. When our thoughts drift away from a primary task, it's very much the default mode network powering that. And you'll probably know in yourself that when you are under stress, you can have more difficulty concentrating because the default mode network is really trying to go back to thinking about possible futures because it feels it maybe needs to rethink them or focus on them, but often that can get in the way. And certainly for individuals with ADHD, that can prevent them having control of their focus. Of course, mind-wandering can often be seen as unproductive, but it's also very brilliant for creativity, future planning, and reassessing one's life goals. And that brings us on to the last thing, which is creativity. Imagination, of course, goes hand in hand with creativity. Recent studies suggest that the default mode network is involved in creative thinking, particularly because it helps you generate new ideas. Its activity during periods of mind-wandering appear to be crucial for creative problem-solving and brainstorming. The other essential thing to understand in general about the default mode network, or I should really start using DMN for short, is that it interacts dynamically with many other networks. Perhaps most importantly, the task-positive network, which is active during your goal-oriented tasks. There's a balance of suppression between the DMN and the TPN, the task-positive network, and that's crucial for effective cognitive functioning. as I mentioned, excessive activity in the DMN can often mean it fails to deactivate properly during your tasks, and that's linked to many mental health disorders, which includes depression, anxiety, and even Alzheimer's. So let's now dive into some of the different problems it can cause us, and start with the first big issue of the day, which is depression. The DMN seems to have extra connectivity and activity in depression. This makes sense because it's very associated with self-referential thoughts and rumination. Repetitive and negative thinking about one's problems is a common symptom of depression. This is compounded by the fact that the DMN doesn't deactivate properly as it should during tasks requiring your attention to the rest of the world. Hence, people can become shut off as this poor modulation between networks leads them to have difficulty concentrating and focusing. Instead, they are focusing on negative thoughts, even during their activities. The connectivity of the DMN has been shown to be quite closely related to the severity of a depression and also correlates with changes of activity following a positive treatment, whether that's with antidepressants, psychotherapy, controlled psilocybin therapy, or other lifestyle changes that have led to them overcoming their depression. But let's just quickly look at antidepressants. There are 4 main types, which we're not going to have time to dig into, but if you do want a deep dive on that, do leave me a comment. But largely, all antidepressants have an active role in the brain's neurotransmitters, and usually they work to help increase the levels of serotonin. The main effect of this on the default mode network is to help modulate it and reduce the negative self-referential thoughts and rumination, whilst also improving your emotional control and responses more effectively. The other big benefit from enhancing the general just regulation of the DMN is that patients will usually have better attention control and less intrusive negative thoughts when they don't need them. In fact, some antidepressants have even been shown to help increase neuroplasticity and help the brain create new connections and activity patterns of the DMN, which just helps them start following new thought patterns that can be more positive. So there is generally some benefits, but of course, talk to a doctor, as I am obviously not here to be recommending any drugs. I'm just fascinated with how things work. Now, let's move on to discussing the second wave of mental health crisis in the world, which is anxiety. Just like with depression, anxiety involves increased activity in our default mode network, the DMN. That correlates with excessive worrying and anticipatory anxiety, where an individual might persistently worry about future events, often envisioning worst-case scenarios. Now, if you haven't listened to it, I did an episode called How to Stop Catastrophizing a few months ago, which was the most shared episode I have ever released, so it must be worth listening to. Anyway, back to the current episode. Interestingly, in anxiety, the DMN shows altered connectivity patterns with other important brain networks, specifically the salience network, which detects significant stimuli in your environment and works out what to do about them, and also the rather business-sounding executive control network, which I can sadly inform you is not a bunch of internal personalities all wearing suits that direct you what to do and having too many meetings about it. No, the executive control network merely just helps regulate your attention. And you need to know this because the dysfunction of your regulation between all of these networks can amplify your anxiety when you fail to regulate between internal self-focuses and your external attention needs. And again, I thought it was interesting to look at how anti-anxiety medication works. There's 2 main types, SSRIs and benzodiazepines such as Valium and Xanax. SSRIs are just one form of antidepressants that focuses on serotonin, which we've already covered. Benzodiazepines, however, enhance the effect of GABA in the brain, which is a neurotransmitter that works to slow your neural activity. By increasing the availability of GABA, you can literally slow down some of the brain's thoughts, which can actually have a very calming effect and reduce your rumination and anxiety. But if you've ever seen someone taking Valium, you might notice it can turn them into a bit of a zombie. Also, if you have any liver or kidney issues, you can have real trouble processing benzodiazepines. And when I was young, my best friend took 2 of them at a party and he completely lost his short-term memory for 3 entire days. You can trust me on this, it did not help his anxiety at all. In fact, he called me every half hour to ask me what the hell was going on because he had no idea where he was or why he was there. And I basically took him home, and every hour he'd be quite baffled as to how he got there, and he'd have 8 showers a day. That's a true story. Luckily, he recovered and his memory started functioning again. But the lesson here, kids, is to not take drugs. Now we can move on to the third major wave of problems in our generation, and that is, of course, ADHD. There is plenty of evidence suggesting that the DMN behaves differently in those with ADHD. Typically, the DMN should deactivate when you engage in tasks that require attention and executive function. But in ADHD, it doesn't deactivate properly and remains active. This means you have increased mind wandering and frequent off-task thoughts and just reduced engagement in your tasks and low focus. Finally, with lower executive function, things like planning, decision-making, and inhibition of inappropriate behaviors don't quite happen as they should. ADHD medication that is out there is based on stimulants, which often surprises people, but it increases a lot of dopamine and norepinephrine to enhance the activity of the task-positive network, which is needed for your focusing of attention on tasks. And by doing this, it helps the deactivation of the DMN during your tasks and helps the two networks regulate themselves in a more suitable manner. Honestly, for myself, as someone who has got ADHD, I have found that taking ADHD medication did make me experience my days in a very different way. It genuinely felt like I had 4 times the amount of time to do anything. My attention wasn't in 5 different places at once. And if I got distracted, like maybe 1 minute would have passed as opposed to a few hours suddenly disappearing and me not really understanding why. However, I also don't like taking drugs all that much, so I generally only take it once a week and instead just try to limit my job to things that are actually really interesting and I can get excited about, like how the default mode network works, which I have to say is way more interesting than you may have thought beforehand. Regardless, these drugs are very powerful and they're also kind of bad for you if you don't have ADHD, so do talk to a professional before coming to any kind of wild conclusions that might well not be correct. At this point, there are lots of other areas we could dive into that relate to the default mode network, like schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and autism spectrum disorder. They are all a bit more nuanced in different extreme ways that they have a problem with the DMN and have less of a cohesive relationship, so I thought we could save them for another time. I did want to look at alternative therapies that have been shown to have a pronounced positive effect on the regulation of DMN, specifically meditation and psilocybin, which were both things we mentioned a lot in a recent episode with Gabrielle Carolambides, who runs America's first legal controlled psilocybin experience. So let's start with looking at meditation and mindfulness. During meditation, the goal for individuals is to focus their attention and specifically reduce mind wandering by trying to bring themselves back to the center and quieten their brain and quieten their mind. Over time, this reduces the activity of their DMN and reduces their self-referential thoughts. It's basically just a battle against your DMN. It's crazy how you don't really heard it spoken about like that. It certainly explains why it helps to reduce your ego. One major goal of a long meditation retreat, for example, is ego dissolution, and that's associated with the Buddhist concept of being enlightened. The other large, obvious benefit is the reduction in stress and anxiety due to the limitation of rumination and worrying that's common in depression and anxiety. In fact, meditation can even improve concentration and attentioning by strengthening your control of the task-positive network when it needs to be used. Furthermore, meditation has been shown to increase emotional awareness and a healthy self-awareness in the present moment, and it gives practitioners a more controlled view of their emotions rather than being lost within them. This is, of course, partly due with how the DMN interacts with emotion-regulating brain networks. And then lastly, meditation can improve your brain health and aging of brain structures, which actually helps maintain cognitive functions for longer. which is insane because I've heard meditators talk about that and been like, but really, how? And now I know. We didn't have time in the episode to talk too much about the DMN's effect on Alzheimer's, but at this point I am like, oh my golly, I do need to do more meditation. I'm sold. I can personally recommend and verify that doing a long 10-day retreat did have many of these benefits for me, though of course, not everybody has the same experience, but the science does say it's mostly a good thing. Now, let's talk about psilocybin. A controlled treatment can induce a state where the usual network connectivity of the brain can be altered, and it especially decreases the DMN. This effect is often described as ego dissolution, the same thing that long-term meditators aim for, and that can be achieved in one day, which makes it a much more accessible treatment for the average person. Essentially, the usual boundaries of self become blurred in a beneficial way. It helps with your emotional well-being as you can gain perspective on your emotions again instead of being lost within them. Patients will often find a pronounced reduction in depression or anxiety due to their profound and meaningful experiences. Patients also seem to gain cognitive flexibility due to the fact that psilocybin helps the brain create new connections and break out of rigid patterns, often associated with things like depression and anxiety. And one of the best things is that the changes in mood and perception seem to have a longer-term effect than other medications, suggesting a longer-term calibration of just brain activity patterns in general. Now, both meditation and psilocybin, I think, are really exciting, and the science behind them is really catching up with the benefits that humans have been aware of for a long time. And it's funny how both of them have a decrease in our self-centered thinking and ego, as well as controlling our rumination, and can genuinely be a large source of relief for many people. I think for maybe 80% of people, they are a really good thing. But there are certainly a few individuals who it could be dangerous for, such as specifically anybody with a family history of schizophrenia or various mental health disorders, and of course, someone with expectations that are just too high. So do talk to a doctor about any of these things before getting too excited just because you heard something on a podcast. Now, I bet you didn't think the default mode network was going to be at the root of some of the world's biggest psychological problems, and I also mentioned that it's linked to Alzheimer's and brain aging, or things like autism. We didn't have time to go into that. Regardless, if you found the episode interesting, or you know anybody that likes stories about crazy German scientists, well, now it's your time to shine and do me a solid and share this episode with a friend. And especially if you do know anyone with depression, anxiety, or ADHD who just wants to understand it better. And if you like this format of an episode that was more of a deep dive into just a term in psychology, let me know and I'll do more of them, because psychology is amazingly fascinating and these scientists do really do interesting stuff. Finally, remember that life is too short to have a dysregulated default mode network going on, so do some more meditation to put your mind at ease. And I would recommend my episode, as I mentioned, on how to stop catastrophizing, because people did genuinely seem to find a lot of use in that. All right, stay safe, don't take drugs out of controlled settings, be kind to yourself, and be kind to someone else too.